left Mafeking in the winter of 1890 as part of a small colonial survey bound into the Kalahari, instruments packed and dry plates stowed for the record. We were 4 Europeans and 8 Tswana escorts, theodolite and plane table lashed to a wagon, chronometer and pocket compass for navigation, a field camera with glass negatives, and Martini Henry carbines. For defense, our purpose was a triangulation of a stretch of the central Kalahari for the colonial survey. I recorded bearings by day and exposures by twilight, while the sand trackers tested the sand for watercourses we could not see. Supplies were stowed for 3 weeks. Water carriers and oxen determined the pace more surely than our maps. We left the lights of Mafeking behind as a pale smear and rode into the hard, clean cold of Kalahari dawns. The air at first light bit at the nose, and the brass of the theodolite would fog until the sun warmed it. Our wagon bore the plane table lashed flat, and the camera in an oilskin trunk. The dry plates, glass and brittle, lay between folds of wool and paraffin paper to keep the heat and grit from flaking the emulsion. I took these plates out at twilight, when the light softened and the exposure times lengthened. The men would steady the tripod by bracing their boots in the sand, and I would call the interval by the watch kept with the chronometer, noting longitude and azimuth as the wheels tinkled on the oxen traces. The work was precise and dull in the particulars, and terrible in the conditions. The theodolite's fine screw would seize in, sand blown into the hinge. The plane table needed squaring with the compass, and then with the sun's direction, the chronometer must be compared twice each day, its balance delicate and its loss in seconds a matter of miles. Our Martini Henry carbines lay near the canvas. We were practiced in their load and cleaning, but they were for deterrence rather than any true hope of defense in that immensity. The Tswana escorts kept us fed and guarded the sand trackers bent low to the sand, hands cupped to feel moisture and to follow the history the ground would reveal to trained fingers. The trackers taught us as much as they guarded us. One, older than the rest by the lines in his face, would scrape the dune with the flat of his hand, and listen where the sand packed differently. He would lift a sprig of grass or a split root and smile, saying there was a pan not far. They read spoor as one reads a letter, the depth and toe mark of an eland, the shallow sift of a hare, the absence where an animal had passed on soft feet and left nothing. They were circumspect about certain places, and when we set up at one of the sparser pans to take a long exposure, they exchanged low phrases I did not understand. The word that returned in English was always the same and always said with a lowered tone: the figure. For 3 days, that presence was only a suggestion, a silhouette arrested on a distant crest at dusk, the suggestion of 2 legs and no animal head, something that did not move like game. Once, at the moment I closed the camera shutter, I saw the dark of it halt against the sky as if it regarded the tripod. On another morning, the oxen would not face a particular wash and stamped and snorted until the handlers coaxed them with blows and millet. The sand trackers paused longer at their tests, their fingers more intent upon grain and soil, and the Tswana escorts began to set small cairns on the lee side of our camp ring, little stacks of stone and bone left as markers. The warnings we had been given, stories of figures that watched and followed, of men who lost their minds or their way, hardened in the cold air into a steady, watching dread. We altered habits. Exposures were made quicker, Routes were varied slightly, watches doubled at night. I logged the bearings and the times as before, but my hand sometimes trembled as I set the needle to north. The chronometer ticked on indifferent to stories. At noon, the sun burnt white across the flat, and the sand shimmered at night. A bitter cold crept through the canvas, and the men huddled closer to the embers, staring into the black that swallowed the horizon. On the fourth evening, the trackers would not smoke. They sat in silence and passed the tobacco with eyes gone distant. And once, when I asked a question, the older man only shook his head and tapped the scrub with his spear, as though pointing at something I could not see. The wagons were unlatched, the plates stowed earlier, and the camera rested in its case. We had not yet seen the figure close enough to touch, but it had learned our pace, or we had learned its, and that small fact altered the map upon which I thought I could rely. We rose on the fifth morning with a sense not of pursuit, but of attention, and I set down in my notebook the first line that was not a bearing, but a record of being watched. The days were a white heat of wind and drifting red sand, the nights raw and cold under a hard sky, and the landscape itself seemed to swallow sound. No larks, no jackal at times, only the creak of axles. Our Tswana guides began to grow taciturn. An elder warned us of a pale figure that walked the dunes at dusk, while a sand tracker traced a set of elongated footprints and frowned at their stride. Mirage played tricks on our sight, but the unease was physical. Our water skins dried faster, and our men kept glancing over the dunes. I kept my journal and my instruments the way a surgeon keeps his scalpel, practical and within reach. By then, we lived by noon sights with the sextant, logged bearings with the prismatic compass, and measured short traverses with the chain. Theodolite work was impossible in the scouring wind, yet when the air fell to a brittle calm at evening, we would set the tripod and take a quick azimuth to fix our line. It was during one of these improvised observations that the tracker, Kua, called me softly and pointed to a pale smudge upon a far dune. At first, I thought it was a bleached antelope, a scrap of bone, anything natural. The thing, if thing it was, kept to the lip of the dune and walked with a gait that made the sand settle differently. No camel shift of hump, nor the spoor of jackal. The prints it left were long and narrow, the heel faint, the forepart elongated as though the foot itself had been drawn out. Kua stooped, pressed his fingers into the ridged sand, and measured the stride by eye. 6 feet, I thought, and a half, far longer than any man of average gait. He spat, frowned, and muttered in his language a phrase I did not command. The elder answered with a soft shake of the head and a hand against his breast, as one might ward a bad scent. We followed those prints at dawn when the wind was down and the sun had not yet blistered the air. They ran level and then climbed a dune and continued on the far side as if the bearer knew a path not for us. Our oxen shied at shells of light and long shadows, and the men kept their rifles within reach. Old Snyder Enfields with their powder stowed in tins, not because I believed in force, but because habit demands some gesture of defense. We lit no fires by day the smell of boiled tinned meat would carry too far. At night, under the Southern Cross, a kerosene lantern would be set low, and men would draw their blankets about their ears, testing the fittings of the wagon, checking lashings, the loose spokes of a wheel, small acts that steadied the mind. On the third evening, the pale figure did not hide upon a distant crest. It walked the Dunnerline parallel to our course, some 200 yards off, and for the first time we saw its outline against the sinking light. It was upright and ungainly, a shape too pale for the red dust, as if some white cloth had been draped on the wind and given a body. It made no sound. The men fell silent as reed grass, and even the old elder could not find the word. I laid down the theodolite, took up my field glass, and felt the muscles at the back of my neck tighten into a remembered soldier's attention. That night, the prints were close to the camp. They ran around the wagon, skirted the circle of our sleeping men, and stopped abruptly where the sand had been raked by a shovel at the well. No one found a scent to follow, no spoor of a domestic animal to prove it had come near us for water. Yet the water skins felt lighter, the leather at the seams had shrunk, as if heat had been added where there had been none. Men muttered of bad air, of fever, but none fell ill. Instead, they slept with one eye open and with rifles within arm's reach, listening to the canvas creak, hearing everything and understanding nothing. On the fourth dusk, the figure altered its bearing and came closer still. I sat upon the tongue of the wagon and watched it walk the horizon like a pale thought. The elder made the sign of protection, and the tracker drew a line in the sand with his heel, one small furrow to mark our place, and said he would keep watch until the moon rose. I asked for volunteers to stand with him. Only 2 men answered, and they did so without bravado. There is a particular hush that attends those who have faced deserts and storms, a tight, practical silence that did not let superstitions spill words. We waited, and the wind held its breath. The outline halted. Then, as if dissatisfied, it turned and walked behind a farther ridge, not away from us, but along a parallel course that ensured we would meet it at the next dune. The tracker sharpened a stick, his knuckles white, and said nothing. I closed my notebook and felt the journal's spine like a hinge between what could be measured and what could not. We would follow its line at first light. On the 3rd morning, we found the prints. They lay across the hard-baked sand as if some tall thing had chosen our track for its own, each impression set with a long stride and a shallow toe pattern that none of our Bamangwato hunters could match, to elephant, eland, or man. I measured one with a rule from my notebook, an interval of near 4 feet from heel to heel, the sole broad, but with no sign of a nail or cloven hoof, the apathetic dust between the toes unmarked by claw or pad. Harrington crouched, his thumb rubbing the powdery edge, and said nothing. Silence was easier than the hypotheses we could not fit to such evidence. A length of canvas, the mouth of a water bag, had been torn and dragged along the ground in that same place. The stitching showed a clean rip, as though the bag had been pinched and wrenched, not bitten. The canvas caught on an acacia thorn and left a pale strip of hair. The hair was thin and almost transparent in the sunlight, and off-white, the color of old parchment. Moses, who had spent his life among wild beasts, turned it over with 2 fingers and said it matched no antelope, no jackal. He laid it against his cheek and made a small sound, part disbelief, part worry. That afternoon, I set up the camera again. The dry plate holder was heavy and cumbersome. In the wind, I balanced the tripod on a sun-bleached termite mound, braced the shutters against a gust, and took 3 exposures across the flat where we had found the impressions. The plate itself did not give any immediate promise in the field. We carried our developing outfit in a canvas case, a bottle of pyro, a small tin of hydroquinone, and a pot of fixer, thiosulfate, kept in the shade lest the sun fog the emulsion. By dusk, In the small dark tent, I mixed the solutions by lamplight, hands coated with desert dust, and worked the plate in the dim as a man works prayer beads. When the emulsion cleared, there was, on one frame, a vague upright shape on the far horizon, too indistinct to classify, lacking detail, but unmistakably human in posture. It stood with one leg forward, shoulders tilted as we had so often seen the field hands at a distance, yet the proportions were wrong. A narrowness through the chest, an elongation of limb that the eye could not set. The evidence accumulated in those small, inexplicable particulars and tightened the knot of fear among the men. We took new precautions out of habit and superstition in equal measure. We set a sentinel at dusk with a brass lantern capped and soot-blackened, and a second man at the wagon with a shovel and the spare rifle. We struck the tent pegs deeper, tied the water skins beneath the axle where they might not be seen, and chained the camels in a semicircle as if to build a last line of defense. We measured bearings with the prismatic compass and took noon sights with the sextant more often than was necessary for pure navigation. The chronometer kept its steady tick, and we marked the hours by its hand as men do when they wish to measure time against terror. At night, the desert made its own noises, the rattle of a loose bit of harness, a distant fox cry, the whisper of sand along canvas. Once, about midnight, Harrington touched my sleeve and pointed. A figure stood beyond the campfire's glare at the lip of the mirage, not close, not monstrous, but present, an outline against the stars. We watched until it melted into the heath haze, and a cloud of sand blew across the ground like slow rain. No man spoke aloud, the rifles lay under blankets, ready, but we did not fire. To shoot at that distance would have been an act without meaning. By the morning of the fifth day, the prints had multiplied and ran alongside our beaten track in a parallel line, sometimes ahead, sometimes at our sides. The men counted them like a tally. We kept the dry plates close after that, and I made another positive when the light permitted. The figure on the horizon did not approach in any direct manner it followed, as a shadow follows a traveller, always set at a measured remove. We were surveyors, bearing the instruments of measurement and the faith that the world could be charted, yet our chain and our theodolite could not take the measure of this thing. We resolved then to press on towards the nearest trading post at Dakar and to take no unnecessary halts. We packed with more care, the water rations strapped to our bodies, and the men moved with an alertness that made them appear younger and older at once. The desert had supplied us with a string of facts: prints, a torn water bag, a strip of hair, a washed-out plate. And with them it supplied a question that would not be answered by our instruments. We kept our watches wound, our bearings set, and in the evenings we spoke of home in lower voices, as if by naming hearth and company we might find an explanation for the figure that followed. One dawn I climbed a low dune to take a bearing and saw it at 30 paces. A tall, gaunt figure standing between two dunes, limbs long and unnaturally still, face turned in our direction though it made no sound. The sun was yet weak, a pale coin at the rim of the world, and the sand gave off the faint, clean smell of cold clay. I remember the fine grit in my mouth and the weight of the theodolite case upon my shoulder. For a moment, I believed it, a man halted to watch us, one of the wandering koi, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs seemed articulated at odd angles, and when it moved, its gait was not like any tracker I had observed. It stepped as a cat does, deliberate, as if testing the way the ground held. I signalled to Hawkins and pushed my fingers through the canvas of my hat to warn Van der Merwe. We raised our Martini Henry rifles and fired 2 warning shots into the air. The crack of the metal seemed too loud in that thin morning. Our emptied cartridges clinked in our hands. The figure flinched and did not run. Instead, it retreated slowly along a swale, the dunes swallowing it like an odd, patient tide. At day's end, it reappeared on the skyline, a silhouette always keeping that impossible distance, as if the rim of the horizon itself belonged to it. Thereafter, the men spoke less of route and azimuth, and more of where the figure showed itself. We altered our hours, beginning work at the first grey with the theodolite and chain laid out, breaking for scant rations at noon when the heat became an acid upon the lips. The paraffin lamp in the cook's tent chimed with a low, oily smell each evening. We took precautions befitting a wild country. Sentinels on the dunes, boots lashed tight with cord, waterskins kept under the men's bellies at night. Yet these measures only proved how small we were. The figure observed the camp and could follow its movement as sure as a shadow follows a man. On the 3rd night after my first sighting, the sound came, soft, like a branch creaking at the edge of the sentry's lantern glow. I had taken the first watch, my hand upon my Webley, while the others slept in the lee of the wagons. The desert kept its own clock. The stars were brittle and strange, and the campfires stank faintly of tinned meat. I saw a tall shape move across the near ridge, and the sentry, a seasoned trooper named Clegg, called out. We lit 2 flares, and the figure halted upon the skyline, then dropped into the hollow as if folded. That was the last time anyone can say we were only observed. At first light, we found footprints where there should have been none. Long, narrow impressions, a footfall too deep at the toe, a dragging line between each print as though a limb had been drawn. The tracks approached within a stone's throw of the mess tent, detouring about the camp and touching the overturned water bucket where old Kofi kept his beans. The men followed them for 2 hours with a chain and compass, past a stand of tamarisk and into a scorched pan that glittered with salt. There the prints ceased, as if taken up by the earth itself. The sand ahead lay unbroken, smooth as an uncut sheet of paper. We could have pursued. Pride and the measurement of our endeavour counselled the march onward the chronometer, and my field notebook lay open to entries with latitude and sun readings. Instead, we agreed, stiff-necked and with a reluctance that was not all fear, to draw back the survey by a day, to make a wide circle, and to mark that sector as an area to be revisited in safer season. That decision cost us time, and it cost more. Van der Merwe's best ox was found the next morning, emaciated and gone from its yoke. The lash that tethered it to the wagon had been unknotted with a care no wild beast would show. Kofi, who had followed the footprints with the others, would later refuse to sleep beyond a certain ridge and left us at the next trading post, returning to his family at the coast. We abandoned the most promising line of triangulation and made for the railway at Kuruman with a parcel of our instruments. Hawkins swore to me then that he had seen the figure stand at the top of a dune and deliver with one slow motion the impression of a hand raised in farewell. There was no malice in the gesture, only a deliberate authority that suggested the country itself had judged us impertinent. We left our empty camp with its tins and tumbled blankets, with one theodolite box dented and a scanner of chain marks unfinished. Back in Cape Town, I lodged formal notes and a plan showing a blanked sector of the Kalahari. My report met the expected skepticism in Admiralty Circle's maps. Must have continuity, and men of science demanded specimens and clear evidence. I have none beyond the notebook where I recorded bearings and the tracings of those strange prints. The men who remained with me were altered in small private ways, less inclined to sleep with the rifle across their knees, quieter when the word dune was spoken. Some swore off deserts entirely. The figure never pursued us to the railhead, nor did it follow the wagon tracks we left. What we learned in that hour was precise and disquieting. We were not merely crossing a wilderness, we had passed into a portion of it that watched, and could, if it chose, keep company with our camps. The map still bears that blank where our chain lay. I have kept the field notebook, I have folded the paper and pressed it into the flyleaf of this journal. The mystery endures in measured lines, and in the way men who have walked those dunes will mute their speech when the wind turns and carries sand across the camp. We aborted the triangulation and beat for Mafeking, abandoning 2 days' rations and a wagon axle that had splintered beneath the tongue when we spurred the oxen to a pace they were never meant to keep. Theodolite, chain and compass were lashed into the wagon's belly. The glass plates I had brought for the camera lay wrapped in oiled wool beside my field notes. Wind scoured the dunes with a dry, tooth-like sound. The sun was a white coin that made men squint and think of water. I remember checking the chronometer and the pocket sextant, not because I believed we could take sights amid the drifting sands, but because habit steadied the hand and steadied the mind. The survey men, hollow-eyed with sand in their beards, moved like men who had been taught to obey the masters, well, even when the master was silence itself. One of the sand trackers refused to return with us. He had followed us these last weeks with a patience born of long acquaintance with a country that eats those who misread it. But on the morning we left, he untied his cloak and sat upon a low dune, palms spread to the sky as if feeling some current beneath the air. He said, simply and without the flourish of our European fear, that the dunes had claimed his kin before that there were places a man might cross only once. No argument, no entreaty seemed to move him. He would not have left in any case. We gave him tobacco and a smoked strip of venison, which he accepted as though performing a small ritual, and then we wheeled away. The will to flight sharpened the senses, tracks that, in the cool of earlier days, we had followed with professional attention, now read like warnings. The sand had shown me the prints, elongated impressions beside the shallow, narrow-taloned marks of a little lizard, the tread neither like an ox nor like a man. The men who had spent their lives on frontier fences exchanged glances that said what they would not say aloud. I wrapped the glass plates in oiled silk and laid them beneath my greatcoat against the chill that comes at night, even in that heat. At dusk, with a lantern guttering and the campfires half smothered to keep less attention, I exposed one plate in the dark box, in the hope of catching, at last, some image to pin this thing upon. The plate showed nothing but a smear, as if wind had brushed across a face in the act of being recorded. It refused to render a creature into lines and form. We journeyed through that night with a haste that left the wagon axles slumping by morning. Food rations that had been measured out like small treasures were left 2 days' worth by order of the man who had charge of stores, his face set and his voice small. The figure came and went along the margins of our light. At times, we found nothing but singular footprints at the edge of a knoll. At others, the wind had erased even those. Once, when we paused for water, the men glanced up to a crest and saw, for the space of a heartbeat, a shape erect against the sky, and then gone as though the world had swallowed the silhouette. No rifle was discharged. No man spoke a loud defiance. We had learned that some things answered noise with patience. When we reached Mafeking, I deposited the glass plates and my notes with the survey office. They placed them upon the ledger shelf and entered, with the clerical neatness that comforts administration, a single line, followed by an unidentified bipedal figure, witness testimony attached. The plates were blurred, the negatives kept no face. The tracker's footprints, sketched carefully by the chief clerk upon foolscap, remained as the only other record. The figure ceased to appear once we left that district. Men who had laughed at one another's superstition felt silent about the Kalahari, where the land had before been fact and map. It became, for them, a margin. In the mess tent, they would lift their cups and change the subject. Years hence, when I returned to the ledger to collate my observations, I found that entry and the faded negatives still waiting, like a bell with no tongue. The dunes kept their secret. Some mornings I woke with the knowledge of a presence at the edge of my dreams, an unanswered pressure that had followed us from an inland beyond empire and remained in the minds of those who had seen it, an absence that would not be filled.